Get ready to uncover groundbreaking ideas, discover the hidden challenges, and explore the untapped potential of marketing in the digital age. This is FairPlay with Arun Kumar, the podcast that takes you on a journey into the impact of data and technology in marketing. Here's Arun.
Hi everyone, this is Arun. Welcome to FairPlay. I have Gerry D'Angelo today as my guest. He is a distinguished figure in the global media and advertising landscape, known and loved by all. Gerry, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Arun.
So Gerry, to start things out, can you just give us a quick rundown of your amazing career?
I, until recently, was the Vice President of Global Media at Procter Gamble, one of the world's largest and perhaps most influential advertisers. I did a number of things there, including providing oversight and best practice to our global media spend, which was not insignificant, driving best practice and capabilities across the rest of the organization, and then getting involved in a number of big industry initiatives like brand safety and suitability. So I was a founding member of GARM, the WFA-led initiative that was trying to drive consistent definitions and metrics in the area of brand safety and suitability and other areas like cross-media measurement. And in addition to that, I was also co-chair of the WFA Media Forum and board. So I got to know a lot of other people in the industry. And those two things, I think, in combination, gave me quite a broad purview across the industry.
You've also sort of, after leaving Procter & Gamble, also gotten into some advisory positions, right?
That's right. So I'm doing maybe about 10 advisory roles in one shape or form. So probably the one that most people have heard of is that I'm part of the senior advisory program at McKinsey. I can't speak too much about that, but that gives me a huge insight into a number of high-level engagements through that. And then in addition, I advise a number of companies directly, mainly in the ad tech space, serving brands and other components of the ecosystem in the areas of primarily measurement in terms of measuring brand safety and suitability, creative effectiveness, carbon emission measurement, and it's a potpourri of direct advisory roles.
So Gerry, I think you're ideally suited to answer this question, which is, we've asked a number of guests on the show and in other places. There are two prevailing notions around this question of, has data and its infusion made marketing better or not? And there are really kind of two polarizing sides. One that says, yes, it's really great. It's driven performance. It's driven accountability. And then on the other set, there is also a feeling that we've gone too deep and we've not really managed to hold on to some elements that can best be seen from above. So we've lost focus on creative. We've lost focus on some of the bigger modeling initiatives, and we've gone too deep in data. Where do you stand on this? I suppose it's a continuum from data has done a lot of good to data has made it harder to market. So where do you stand on that continuum?
Yeah, it's a great question, Arun. With any slightly tricky question like this, because I think it's not an easy one to answer, I sometimes find it's easy to make the case for and against something like that. And I think that you can do that relatively easily because you can start to see some advantages. I certainly have seen some advantages, but you also start to see some disadvantages. And I think the starting with the case for data and its application to media and marketing more broadly, I think it's brought a level of accountability that was sorely needed. So I started in the business more than 3 decades ago. And for a good proportion of those early years, the work that we were doing in advertising and marketing more broadly was often challenged in terms of the level of accountability. How do we really know that this level of investment is really going to pay back over a particular time period? And I recall some quite fun, interesting conversations I had with financial colleagues who were holding purse strings of various organizations that I worked at the time. And they said, look, how do we really know that there's going to be a return on investment? And at the time, this was like at least 2 decades ago now, I felt quite bereft as a marketeer to be equipped to be able to say, look, we have a high level of confidence that if you give me this significant amount of money, I'm going to be able to generate return, whether that was in terms of incremental revenue or incremental profit. So I think the injection of data enabled by technology has really raised the bar for accountability. So I think there's definitely a mark in the positive side of the ledger. However, at the same time, it's also very easy to start to see some of the excesses that's created. So one thing I would point to there is the amount of value creation for the intermediaries. So it used to be very, very straightforward as an advertiser, relatively straightforward as an advertiser. The process of creating marketing and advertising and executing in media was a simple enough process. There was the brand, there was probably one intermediary, which was some kind of agent, whether it's creative or media or combined, and then there were publishers and there were consumers. And now there's an absolute multiplicity of intermediaries, and you can see that most recently in the last of the 2 installments of the A&A programmatic supply chain report, which dropped, I think, in December of last year. You can just see that waterfall that they produced. And so it's quite hard to be able to look at that in a positive way and think, well, hang on a sec, as brands or advertisers, we're funding that entire ecosystem. So how can we square this immense amount of value creation, whether it's that waterfall chart that you look at as a proof point, or whether you look at the market capitalization of many of these entities and think that that's a good thing. And then the other area that I would point to is that there's been a huge amount of, there's been this drip feed of many, many, many stories relating to the excesses of data and how that's damaged the interests of consumers. Whether you go back to the Cambridge Analytica scandal, or whether more recently the Adlytics reports. And so I think it's very hard to be able to balance and say in its entirety data is a good thing, because yes, on the one hand, it has driven a level of accountability that was sorely required, but at the same time, there are some unforeseen circumstances which I think, looking back at them now, we would rather those things hadn't happened. I'm not trying to dodge the question in any way, but I think you can certainly make the case for and against.
And so I'd like to go back to that A&A report, because the A&A has been doing these reports regularly. And, right from 2015 onwards, there have been regular recommendations on how to address this. Why is it that we still spend a significant percentage of our budgets, knowing what we do and knowing what we've done over the last 4 or 5 years, where so much still goes to MFA sites, so on? Like, what's preventing us from not doing it anymore? Like, what's the incentive?
So just let me make sure I understand the question, which is, given that the ANA and other industry bodies have been producing these reports, which are sort of highlighting the lack of transparency in the supply chain, whether it's agencies more broadly or programmatic in the more recent reports, if I understand the question correctly, why does the problem keep surfacing? And I think I go back to part of what I was alluding to in my answer to your first question, which is the supply chain. And I think you really do need to look at it as a supply chain with handoffs and intermediaries. That supply chain has got really complex, both in terms of the number of intermediaries and also the complexity of the provision. So just to give you an example, I was doing some work for one of my advisory clients, and because I get the opportunity of spending some time with them, I get to understand their proposition. I can really begin to see how it adds value to brands directly. And when I spoke to one of my industry contacts, a very large advertiser, it became clear that they just couldn't deal with the relative complexity of the proposition because they were having to do so many other things. They were having to worry about the day-to-day running of the operations of their business. So for the ability for them to kind of stop and give enough sort of time and space to go, this is really quite interesting, I'm going to try and understand it, and then I'm going to try and apply it to their business. People just don't have time to do that now. And so I think that the rising tide of complexity in the supply chain and the decreasing time and capability on the brand side to really understand what's going on is creating all of these snafus, all these problems. And the problems just bounce from one topic and subject to another. So back in 2016, when the first K2 report dropped that was sponsored by the ANA, that was very much about what media agencies were doing financially on the back end of a lot of these transactions. And a lot of it was relating to volume rebates. More recently, it's been about MFAs because that was the big takeout from the ANA reports. And I'm sure in 3 or 6 months' time, it might be something else. But I think the underlying, whilst the symptoms may change, the underlying problem is that our supply chain, our way of brands communicating through to consumers and the process contained therein has become complex beyond our comprehension as brands' ability and capability and time has decreased. And I think that's what's happening. You're just going to keep getting it. And I would probably predict, in fact, I do predict, I'm sure in 3 or 6 months' time, we'll be talking about some other scandal.
That definitely seems to be something that we need to be cognizant about. One of the adjacent areas to this is the relationship with the big tech platforms. Because over time, I feel almost like way back in 2010 when we started, it was a much more open internet. And now that has steadily become more balkanized, siloed. There are things you can do, you can't do. And there's almost like these buckets that you go into. There's this 35% open web, and then the rest of the 65% is divvied up. One of the things that has not quite happened is in the 90s and 80s, you had clients and agencies having very strong points of view on publishers and broadcasters, and they seem to have the upper hand, and that seems to have changed. Why is it that marketers don't speak up more about issues relating to big tech? Because, for example, I'm sure it's not great that you're not able to get measurement working horizontally. Like you have each person grading their own report card and giving you reports, and you wouldn't accept it otherwise. But we accept it. We tend to accept it and say, they're trustworthy, we'll just go ahead with it. And then we've seen in the case of Meta, for example, where the metrics were not quite right and there was a big controversy over that, etc. So what's preventing us as an industry of unifying and saying, we're going to set some standards, and these standards need to be met by all technology platforms? And this is like the same way that, we do it with agencies. Why can't we do that with publishers?
No, I think that's a great question. I think, first of all, I'd take a stab at trying to answer why that happens. And I think it's no more complicated than these platforms got to be very big very quickly. And we can spend, a lot of time talking about how that happened, but they were effectively giving away their service for free. So they ended up through this provision of free at the point of consumption for consumers and the network effect of particular social media platforms. They got really big really, really quickly. And then when they started to then monetize and certainly commercialize their propositions, they started to be very large companies. And I remember at one point, I made a comparison between the market capitalization of, I think, Google or Facebook at the time, and what was a large entity on the advertiser side, which is Procter Gamble. And actually, those companies were by a factor of 15 or 20 larger than even some of the largest advertisers. So I think that's why it happened. In terms of what do we do about it, I can point to at least 2 examples where we started to turn the ship a little bit. So one is in the area of brand safety and suitability, and the other is in the area of cross-media measurement, which you referenced. And yes, it took some terrible, tragic events, and in particular, Christchurch in New Zealand, when I think it was 20 or 22 people were killed, and it was live streamed on Facebook Live at the time. That was actually the galvanizing event after previous events hadn't been sufficient to galvanize the industry for the industry to come together. And under the auspices of trade organizations at the time, it was the World Federation of Advertisers, to really do something in a meaningful way about that. And that in turn led directly to GARM, the Global Alliance for Responsible Media. GARM, for those listeners who aren't aware of it, is the industry initiative designed to address brand safety and suitability issues and find solutions. But GARM at its core was actually an entity kind of led by advertisers. So the steering group for that was advertisers, but it encompassed a broader community, including the platforms. And so we were driving the agenda, and we had to start with almost like amino acid level building blocks. Okay, can we just start by sizing the problem, and then as solutions develop, how do we then measure our progress? So we had to start with some really basic things like, do we have the same consistent definitions of unsafe content across various platforms? And we realized that we didn't. And so we had to address that. Are we then measuring things in the same way? So if there's a metric relating to unsafe brand content on a platform, does that mean the same metric on other platforms? So there was a lot of standardization and harmonization. And then from there, we were able to build on that platform. Whilst it's far and away, it's not mission accomplished, there's still lots and lots of work to be done there. That is a really good example of, I think, where in order to address the size and power of a lot of these big companies, advertisers had to come together, and the only way that they could do that was under the auspices of trade organizations. And a very similar thing has been happening on cross-media measurement. And whilst that one's been a little bit sort of lower on the radar, I think that's equally impressive in terms of the progress that's being made there. And in both of those instances, we couldn't have done it unless it was a collective effort across representing many advertisers that were convened by trade organizations, that we had to do it in partnership with these platforms. So I think it is possible, and I think we can point to some initial progress that has been made on both of those two areas, but there's still a huge amount to be done.
So can I just stop on cross-media measurement? Just because, as you mentioned, it is not in the limelight as such. And whenever it does come into the limelight, most people talk about how it's dysfunctional. But I just wonder if you could shed some light on what are some of the achievements that have been made or progress that has been made that we often don't talk about. Like, I definitely don't see any mention of it in the trade press.
Yeah, I actually, Lord, I'm so glad you say that, because I think the work of cross-media measurement as an initiative that was fostered and enabled by the WFA and is now coming to life in the UK as part of Project Origin, and in the US, in their recently announced Project Aquila, and I think I'm pronouncing that the right way. It's taken a very long time. It's taken 3 to 4 years. But the work there has basically been to say, like, where should we focus our attention? And most money is going behind video of one sort or another. So we're looking at linear television, and we're also looking at digital. The second thing has been to produce a model by which reach and frequency can be calculated, but in a way that's privacy compliant. And basically that's being done. I'm not a huge expert as the technology and the methodology behind it, but I understand that the way that is being done is in a virtual sense. It's not using tracking of any sort. It's not deterministic. It's using, in effect, highly sophisticated probabilistic modeling to figure out that these impressions that are being fed into the system, are they unique, or are they an impression from an existing person? And so we're very slowly able to then build a probabilistic model, which once you then start feeding with data, and this is the stage that they're at now. So the effort, the initiative was convened by the WFA. It was brought to life by ISBA in the UK, and now by the ANA in the US. A lot of that engineering work was done with the assistance and financial support from a lot of platforms. So it got up and running, it was working. All it needed was data feeds to start coming into it. And actually, to my surprise, that's the area that's been most challenging. because a lot of linear broadcasters in both of those two markets, I think, have been a bit wary of leaning into those two projects because they feel that they have something to lose. Actually, my argument would be they have the most to gain from that because they're the ones who are losing revenue on a ongoing basis to a number of these bigger platforms. So if you felt that there was that sort of piqued your curiosity sufficiently, you wanted to know more, very, very happy, I think, to follow up with some of my colleagues there from the WFA and the ANA to talk to it in perhaps more specific terms. I've been more involved on the brand safety and suitability piece, so that's where I can speak to personal experience. But I think looking across at cross-media measurement, I think it's equally impressive.
So knowing what you know now, with whatever has happened over the last, let's say 2 decades, with digital going up, popping, then programmatic coming in, messing everything up, and then data coming up. And now data is in the zone of messing things up and so on and so forth. Do new marketers who are entering the industry now, or people who are becoming CMOs now, what would be your advice of things that probably previous generations did that you would want them to avoid or do differently?
I would say whether it's somebody that's been in the industry for a while but is adapting to the new realities, or newer people coming to the industry and then getting promoted up to more senior and influential roles, I would say that it's really important to do 2 things, really. So the first thing is just understanding what basic tenets of marketing do not change, what changes and what doesn't change. And once you've got that sort of clear in your head, it becomes a lot easier to do the second thing, which is, what do I really need to leverage in terms of the latest capabilities in order to build upon that kind of foundational knowledge? So I would definitely say go through the process of really understanding what changes and what doesn't change, and then use that knowledge and capability to leverage the newest things that are available to you as marketeers. And I think that there are some really deep-rooted, unchanging truths about how people buy things that are rooted in behavioral economics. I personally, I'm still a big believer in the principles of physical and mental availability. So consumers cannot buy a product unless it is physically available for them to buy. And in the old world, that was an expression very much of physical distribution, retail distribution. So the number of stores that you're in and your presence in those stores. Mental availability, I think, that is unchanging as well. Consumers do not carry around in their head long lists of brands that they have, quote unquote, relationships with. They lead their lives, and there are things that happen in their lives that cause them to want to enter into a category. And once they're entering into a category, then they will generally steer towards those brands that they have some kind of awareness or affinity towards based upon their previous experience. So I'm still a big believer in physical and mental availability. How you then execute in the new world may change. And a super good example of that, I think, is on the physical availability piece. If you look at something like search, one could argue that search and your presence in search listing results, whether it's organic or paid search, is an expression of physical availability. Like, if you just have to be there, it's almost like the cost of doing business. And so that's the advice that I would give to people, either who've been in the business for a long time, which is like, don't forget some of the foundational knowledge that you have, or to new people coming into the industry, which is as quickly as possible, try and acquire some of that foundational knowledge so that you can then execute with excellence using all the latest tools and capabilities to hand. The one thing not to do is chase around and just be try to use the latest, newest thing just for the sake of it being the newest and the latest.
Got it. So since you talked about things that are never changing, and given your background with CPGs, which have usually been the harbingers of changes in media theory, back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, we had Arun, we had Efron, we had all these theories around recency, frequency, what actually makes an impact, etc. And then for the longest time, I felt like digital came in and there was all this other stuff that happened, but there wasn't really any linkage between that and the theories. And then we got the MMA with the movable middle framework. So I was interested in checking with you, have you seen any movements in theory that have inspired you, that have made you think differently? Is there anything which we should be reading up on, catching up on, that you wish marketers read up on? Or do you think the old theories hold true?
Yeah, well, I this might sound a little bit trite, but firstly, I would consider myself to be a sort of devotee to the Ehrenberg-Bass orthodoxy for a couple of reasons. One is that they work very much on the basis of, like other scientists, of establishing a hypothesis and then running and rerunning examples backed with data to prove out that hypothesis. So that, this is the replicable events, I think they refer it to. So I'm a big believer in that. And I can see that coming to life from my own personal experiences, whether it was at Mondelez previously or more recently at Procter Gamble. So I would say, whilst there are, be open to other theories, I think that is a really good place to start. And in terms of what to read up on, I definitely, and I'm not associated with the Institute, the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute in any way, but membership to the Institute does actually have quite a lot of value, and you have access to a whole repository of work there, not just in the media space, but more broadly in the marketing space. I personally have found the most value. I don't quite know where I found it, but they issue a number of reports, and one of them, I think it's called Report 66, is actually a compilation of all of them. It
is a very famous report that a joint friend of ours shared it with me. So,
excellent. So we're on common ground there. I would say that little 5-page PDF is probably my most read piece of academic literature because A, it's quite short and very easy to understand. And so I keep going back to that again and again. And I think it links back to my earlier question, which is that you do need some kind of underpinning of unchanging facts that help you to steer through newer and newer realities. And that has certainly been my touchstone. I can understand how other people might look to others, but the reason it resonates with me, I saw the results play out time and time again in real world business results, but also it resonates in my real life. The whole idea of frequency, for example, the number of times I've had to engage in conversations about what is the right level of frequency, and if you extrapolate the logic, you can't have a situation where one consumer is responsible for all of the volume for your brand or your category. It just doesn't make sense. People don't wash their hair that often, or their clothes that often, or brush their teeth that often. And so therefore spreading your impressions to generate reach and minimizing your frequency, that's the best way of investing your money. And that is something that I've been discussing time and again in the last decade or so.
So Gerry, we covered the past, but next I want to get into the future and of course, talk about a future which includes AI. Also coming up in the second part of our talk, Gerry is going to share the powerful discipline he learned while working at Procter Gamble.
Everything needs to be in service of the consumer. And if you start there and all of your decision making is in service of the consumer, you can't go far wrong, I would say.
This has been Fair Play with Arun Kumar. If you want to uncover the keys to using data wisely and fairly in an ever-changing world, go to arunkumar.com for more insights and resources. Fair Play is a production of Forbes Books.